We know what a dynamic block is, and we've seen how to use them in a drawing. But how do you make them? Well, that part is a bit more tricky. There are many settings that you can apply to a dynamic block. The first step is to decide what you need and how you want it to be manipulated or changed. Let's keep it simple for now. For a block to be dynamic, it must have at least one parameter. A parameter usually has an action associated with it. Parameters define properties like locations, distances, or angles. When a parameter is met, the action goes into effect. The action defines how the parameter changes the block. Remember this when you create your dynamic blocks. So let's start the block editor. On the ribbon, go to the Home tab, go to the Block panel, and you'll see right here the block editor. Or you can type in bEdit on your command line. If you have an existing block, this will open it up. If you want to make a new one, you have to type in a new name. So let's say what we want to call it. Well, what we want to do is call this square. We're going to keep this simple. This will open up the block editor. I'm going to close our tool palette because it's going to get in our way. Now, one of the problems with the block editor is that you get a lot of extra things. You have your regular properties tool palette open if you have it open. You can close that. I'm going to help us save some space. You get a contextual tab in your ribbon up here called Block Editor. Now, you can still access all of your other tabs, but it takes you to the Block Editor. You also get the block authoring palettes that comes up here. This is where you can find your parameters and your actions that I had mentioned earlier. Now, certain parameters will only go with certain actions and vice versa. You have to have a parameter and you have to have an action. So a lot of those are pre-configured for you in this tab called Parameter Sets. This will insert an action and a parameter. And you can see there are a lot of choices here. Now, what can you make with a dynamic block? Well, that's really up to you. Let your imagination go, your creativity flow, and make something. What we're going to do here, though, is to show you some of the basics in the construction and forming of a dynamic block. And we're going to keep it very simple. So we've created this block and it's called square. Now let's draw a 12-inch by 12-inch square. Use the rectangle command. Pick a point. Type in 12, then the tab button, and 12 again. And here we go. So we've drawn a rectangle that's 12 by 12. That's our first step. Now what we want is a dynamic block where we can change the length of the sides, but keep it a parallelogram. Okay, well, we need to add the linear parameter to the top line. That's this right here. We have our linear. This will keep a linear distance. You can apply it a lot like applying a dimension. So pick it. And now we pick our first start point, which is going to be the end point here of the square. And then we want to go to the other end point. That's our distance. Now, when you add a parameter, if it doesn't have an action associated with it, you'll get this little yellow exclamation point glyph. So every parameter, remember, needs an action, and you start with the parameters. So what we want to do is we want to change this block dynamically so that we can stretch it and still leave it as a parallelogram. Now we have to add our action. Every parameter has to have an action. Now we have our linear distance. What we want to do is add our stretch, because that's what we're doing. So now we select our parameter. That little glyph thing here, that's what we pick. Now we need to tell it where we're associating it with. What part are we stretching? Are we stretching this endpoint or this endpoint? It really doesn't matter, it's up to you. I'm going to pick over here and pick this point. Now we have to specify the first corner of our stretch frame. So if you were going to stretch this square with the stretch command, how would you pick that with a window? You'd pick up here and pick here. So these are the items that are being stretched. This line, and then this one here. Once you've picked everything, press enter. And now you need to make sure you pick all of your objects. Now it's kind of redundant, but that's what happens. Press enter, and here you go. This is your little stretch glyph here. It tells you what it is. If you select it, it highlights what's being stretched. If If you right click on it, you can delete it. You can modify the selection or get a brand new selection altogether. You can rename the action. You can show them, you can hide them, all sorts of things. Well, that's it in a nutshell. Just close the block editor up here and then save the changes to square. Now insert it. And if we did everything correctly, this should work. Now, if you do it and it doesn't work, don't worry. Dynamic blocks, even simple ones like this, can be very tricky. This is a very simple example of a dynamic block. There are some dynamic blocks that are extremely complicated, and there are a lot of things you can do with it. Think of it sort of as programming your geometry. But we could also add other things to this stretching ability. We could increment it so that they only stretch in certain unit steps, like 1 unit, 2 unit, 3 units. We can stretch it up as well as across the screen. We can rotate it. We can change visibility states so that it goes from a square to a rectangle or a hexagon or anything. It just depends on exactly what you need. So you create your dynamic block to fit that need.